The cameras were already rolling when the atmosphere inside the Capitol hearing chamber turned electric. The crowd wasn't here for numbers or policy jargon, they were here because something historic was about to happen. Former President Donald Trump had returned to testify, flanked by his attorneys, confident smirk intact, a man who believed no stage could ever swallow him whole. But across the table sat Denzel Washington, no longer just an actor but a voice sharpened by years of watching injustice harden into law. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't playing to the crowd. He was steady, calm, deliberate, the kind of presence that made silence feel heavier than noise. The air vibrated with tension, like the seconds before thunder splits the sky. Trump leaned toward the microphone, ready to unload his signature barrage of bravado, insults, and half-truths. But before he could even finish his opening line, Denzel's hand lifted, steady as a gavel, and his voice cut through the air with surgical clarity. "Mr. Trump, history won't remember the walls you built. It will remember the lives you tried to break." The room froze. Reporters dropped their pens, cameras zoomed in tighter, aides shifted in their seats as though they'd been caught in a storm they didn't prepare for. Trump blinked, the smirk flickering just slightly, as if for the first time in years someone had spoken a truth he couldn't brush aside with mockery. Trump wasn't used to silence. He thrived on chaos, on applause, boos, gasps, anything that proved he still commanded the room. But this silence was different. It wasn't the hush of respect, it was the pause of a nation realizing the balance of power had shifted. He cleared his throat, leaned forward, and tried to regain control. "Denzel," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension, "you're just an actor. Stick to scripts and leave the real battles to those who built this country." A few chuckles rose from his side, the usual sycophants desperate to validate him. But they didn't last. Denzel leaned into his microphone, his eyes locked on Trump with a stillness that felt more dangerous than anger. "Built this country?" His words carried the weight of a hammer on stone. "Mr. Trump, men like you built cages, redlined neighborhoods, and turned poverty into policy. Don't you dare pretend those walls are monuments, they're scars." The chamber erupted. Some gasped, others clapped before realizing they weren't supposed to. Trump's face flushed crimson, the smirk evaporating into a tight scowl. He opened his mouth, but Denzel didn't give him the chance. "I'm not here to perform. I'm here because truth doesn't need a teleprompter. You can brand me as an actor, but I've seen more honesty in a stage script than in your 4 years of speeches." The crowd roared, a wave of energy rising from the gallery and crashing down on the hearing room like a tidal force. For the first time, Trump looked cornered. Not by a prosecutor, not by a judge, but by words sharper than any indictment. Across the nation, millions watching at home felt something ignite. Hashtags began trending instantly, hashtag Denzel speaks truth, hashtag Trump humiliated. The moment had transformed. This wasn't just testimony. It was resistance, live, undeniable, and irreversible. The silence didn't last. Trump slammed his palm against the table, the microphone rattling as his voice broke into the chamber with raw fury. "You think you're the voice of America, Denzel? You're nothing but Hollywood's puppet. You wouldn't last a single day making real decisions for real people." His words were jagged, flung into the room like broken glass. Aides behind him nodded furiously, but the audience wasn't buying it. Their faces showed it, half disbelief, half disgust. The camera zoomed closer, catching every twitch of his jaw, every bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned forward, slow and deliberate, like a lion who knows the prey is exhausting itself. "Real decisions?" His voice dropped to a low, steady tone that forced the room to lean in. "Mr. Trump, the real people you speak of are the families buried under medical debt, the children locked in cages, the workers you called disposable. Real decisions aren't made by tearing people down, they're made by lifting people up. And you, sir, only ever look down." The words cut through the chamber like a blade, drawing audible gasps. Trump stuttered, searching for a retort, but Denzel wasn't finished. He opened a folder, thick with reports and testimonies, and spread the pages across the table like evidence in a trial. Here's what your leadership left behind: rising hate crimes, fractured communities, families split apart. That's not leadership. That's vandalism dressed in a flag. The gallery broke into murmurs, some even clapping before being silenced by the gavel. Reporters typed frantically, headlines already forming: Washington dismantles Trump's legacy line by line. Trump sat back, his face stiff, his eyes narrowing. He had faced prosecutors, journalists, even world leaders, but none had landed blows like this. Denzel wasn't just speaking, he was building a record, moment by moment, word by word. For millions watching, it felt like the unmasking of an emperor who'd long pretended to wear clothes. Twitter, TikTok, and news outlets exploded simultaneously. A single phrase from Denzel's rebuttal began to trend: vandalism dressed in a flag. The resistance wasn't just growing, it was roaring. Trump leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into that familiar sneer, but this time there was no laughter in the room to prop him up. He jabbed his finger toward Denzel, the gesture sharp, almost trembling with frustration. You talk about families, debt, cages, big words, emotional words. But when I was in charge, this country was respected. People feared us, markets obeyed us, and no Hollywood star could rewrite that history. His voice boomed across the marble chamber, bouncing off the walls like a desperate echo, but the energy it carried was hollow. It didn't shake the crowd. It didn't silence the murmurs. Denzel waited until the noise settled. He didn't rush, didn't interrupt. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, deliberate, designed to pierce deeper than volume ever could. Respected? Fear isn't respect, Mr. Trump. It's the mask tyrants wear when they've run out of love to give. And history doesn't remember fear, it remembers the damage left behind. The impact was instant. The chamber seemed to tighten, like oxygen had been pulled from the air. Trump's face twitched, his eyes narrowing into slits, but before he could launch another barrage, Denzel raised a single sheet of paper. It was a testimony from a mother whose child had been separated at the border. He read aloud her words, voice steady but heavy: "My son cried for me for 38 days. They told me he would forget. He has not forgotten." The gallery fell into silence, a silence that cut deeper than any outburst. Reporters froze mid-sentence, some visibly shaken. Trump shifted in his chair, his bravado faltering for just a second, but it was enough. Cameras captured it, an unmistakable flicker of vulnerability on the face of a man who had built his image on invincibility. Denzel placed the paper down carefully, like it was a piece of evidence in a trial that couldn't be ignored. "You built policies that scarred children," he said, his voice now resonant with controlled anger. "That isn't respect. That is cruelty masquerading as governance. And cruelty, Mr. Trump, always collapses under the weight of truth." The words echoed far beyond the room. Social media erupted, late-night anchors replayed the clip within minutes, and hashtags surged: hashtag cruelty collapses, hashtag truth versus Trump. For millions watching, it was no longer just a hearing. It was history unfolding, one devastating sentence at a time. By the fifth hour of the hearing, fatigue should have dulled the edges of the confrontation. But instead, the tension had only sharpened. Trump leaned forward again, his voice lower now, like a boxer conserving energy after taking too many hits. "You think you can define me with your stories? You think you can bury 4 years of progress with one mother's tears? I gave this country strength. I made America feared again. That's what real leadership looks like." His words carried the familiar rhythm of his rallies, but without the roar of a crowd, they landed flat. Denzel did not blink. He allowed the silence to stretch until the weight of Trump's words collapsed under their own emptiness. Then he answered, voice firm, each syllable like a nail being hammered into the coffin of false bravado. "Strength without justice is nothing but intimidation. And intimidation, Mr. Trump, is the coward's weapon. You didn't make America feared, you made America fractured. You turned neighbors into enemies and politics into a battlefield where truth was the first casualty." The audience erupted, this time not in scattered murmurs, but in a collective gasp, a chorus of disbelief and recognition. Trump's eyes widened, his jaw tightening as if he had been struck physically. He tried to interject, but Denzel pressed forward, holding up another document, this one filled with FBI statistics on hate crimes during Trump's tenure. "These are your numbers, not mine," he said. "You didn't build strength. You built suspicion. You built division. And those foundations are already crumbling under the weight of their own hatred." Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Screens across America lit up with bold headlines: "Washington calls Trump's strength, coward's weapon." Hashtags surged again, #coward's weapon, #Denzel versus Trump. For the first time, Trump shifted uncomfortably in his chair, pulling at his collar, his usual mask of dominance slipping just slightly. The cameras caught it all, the bead of sweat rolling down his cheek, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was the image that would loop endlessly on late-night news, the moment when bluster met immovable truth. And in that clash, the resistance grew louder than ever. The hearing room was beginning to feel less like a chamber of government and more like a battlefield of memory and morality. Trump tried to recover, leaning into his old rhythm, pounding the table lightly as though the noise itself might drown out the sting of Denzel's words. "The people loved me," he barked. "They came by the tens of thousands to hear me speak. They cheered because I gave them hope. You can't erase that. You can't take that away." His voice carried bravado, but his eyes darted toward the cameras. He knew the optics mattered more than the argument. The problem was, the cameras weren't on him anymore. Every lens in the room seemed fixed on Denzel, who sat motionless, calm, as though he'd been preparing his entire life for this precise confrontation. Finally, Denzel spoke, and his words dripped with quiet precision. "Crowds don't equal conscience, Mr. Trump. A mob cheering doesn't make a man righteous, it only makes him louder. You had an army of voices, yes. But tell me, what did they cheer for? Walls? Bans? The humiliation of the weak? History doesn't measure applause. It measures the scars left behind when the cheering stops." The weight of those words pressed into the chamber like stone. Even Trump's allies shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the cameras. Denzel wasn't finished. He pulled out a small pocket constitution, worn at the edges, and placed it firmly on the desk in front of him. "This," he said, tapping the cover, "is the voice that outlives every rally. And it will outlive you too. Because freedom built on cruelty isn't freedom, it's fraud." The audience erupted again, this time in a wave of energy that seemed to shake the very marble walls. Reporters abandoned discretion, some clapping, others nodding. Hashtags multiplied in real time, #fraud not freedom, #Denzel versus Trump, #scars over cheers. Trump sat back, his lips pressed tight, the color in his face shifting between defiance and something he rarely allowed to show, uncertainty. The cameras captured the moment, the smirk gone, replaced by a hollow stare. For millions watching across America, it wasn't just a clash of words anymore. It was the crumbling of an illusion. By now, the hearing had transformed into something far larger than its original purpose. It wasn't just about policies or party lines, it was about the soul of a nation on trial. Trump, visibly rattled, leaned forward once more, his fists clenched against the table. His voice, though strained, still carried that familiar bombast. "You speak of scars, Denzel, but those scars made America strong. They reminded us that only the toughest survive. Weakness destroys nations, and you," he jabbed a finger across the table, his face flushed, "you glorify weakness." The chamber buzzed with murmurs. Some of his loyalists nodded, but the energy was fading. Trump's words no longer sparked fire, they sounded desperate, almost rehearsed. Denzel, however, remained still, his composure unshakable. Slowly, he adjusted the microphone, letting the silence stretch until even the restless crowd fell quiet. "Strength that feeds on pain isn't strength," Denzel began, his voice low, deliberate. It's cannibalism. A nation that devours its own people is a nation headed for collapse. And what you call weakness, compassion, justice, humanity, those are the bricks that build civilizations that last. History doesn't remember the loudest tyrants. It remembers the quiet builders who planted seeds of hope while men like you tried to burn everything down. The word struck like thunder. Some in the audience gasped audibly, while others began to cheer, unable to contain the surge of energy flooding the room. Cameras zoomed in as Trump's jaw tightened, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. He tried to interject, but Denzel's voice only grew stronger. You didn't build America's greatness, you siphoned it. You didn't strengthen communities, you hollowed them out. And you call that survival? No, Mr. Trump. That's sabotage. The chamber erupted, the sound of applause echoing so fiercely that the gavel pounding for order was drowned out entirely. Headlines began flashing across screens within minutes. Denzel calls Trump's legacy, sabotage of America. On social media, hashtags like #SabotageLegacy and #Denzel shuts Trump down surged into trending territory. In that instant, the tide wasn't just turning, it had already turned. Millions watching recognized the shift. This was no longer Trump's stage. It was Denzel's, and he had seized it with truth as his only weapon. Trump, though visibly shaken, refused to let the moment slip entirely. He leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk as if he were still in control. Beautiful speech, Hollywood, he sneered, the sarcasm dripping. But the real world doesn't run on bedtime stories. It runs on power. It runs on control. And people want someone strong enough to protect them, not some actor lecturing about feelings. The room stiffened again. Trump's loyalists clapped desperately, but the applause sounded hollow, scattered. Denzel didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shout. Instead, he leaned forward, his tone calm but edged with steel. Power without conscience isn't protection, it's oppression. And let me remind you, America wasn't built by men who worshipped control. It was built by people who believed in liberty even when it terrified the powerful. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Trump's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, the mask cracking. Denzel seized it. He gestured toward the gallery, where veterans, teachers, nurses, and small business owners filled the seats. Ask them, he continued, his hand steady. Do they feel safer when leaders mock their pain? Do they feel represented when the loudest voice drowns out every other? No. They feel abandoned. Forgotten. Betrayed. Suddenly, a voice from the back row broke the tension. A middle-aged veteran stood up, his voice trembling but firm. He's right. We didn't fight for fear. We fought for freedom. The room froze, the weight of the moment undeniable. Phones whipped up to capture it, and within minutes, the clip would race across the internet. Trump tried to reassert himself, slamming his hand on the table. Order. This is a joke, a setup, a circus. But the energy was gone. The crowd wasn't with him anymore. They were with Denzel. And in that silence that followed, the reality became undeniable. The stage that Trump thought was his fortress had become Denzel's pulpit. His truth had pierced through the noise, cutting sharper than any insult or slogan ever could. By now, the courthouse felt less like a trial chamber and more like a theater of reckoning. Trump's fists clenched on the table, his jaw tightening as he scanned the room for a lifeline. But the crowd had shifted, their eyes weren't on him anymore. They were fixed on Denzel, who stood tall, shoulders squared, his voice carrying with a quiet conviction that needed no microphone. You talk about strength, Denzel said, his tone measured yet powerful. But true strength isn't about silencing the weak. It's about listening to them, standing with them when it costs you something. A man who builds his legacy on fear is not strong, he's scared. The words landed like thunder. Trump's face reddened, his finger jabbing the air. I'm not scared of anyone. I've faced dictators, I've faced enemies, I've faced the fake news media. Don't you dare lecture me about fear. But his outburst only highlighted the contrast. Where Trump's anger seemed wild and defensive, Denzel's calm radiated control. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped closer, his gaze steady, his words precise. Fear isn't always loud, Mr. Trump. Sometimes it hides behind the roar. Sometimes it looks like a man who can't stand to be questioned. Sometimes it looks like walls and cages built to keep voices out. The gallery stirred. A teacher in the front row murmured "Amen" under her breath. A college student wiped tears from her eyes. Even some of Trump's staunch supporters looked uneasy, shifting in their seats. Cameras zoomed in, reporters scribbled furiously, and the hashtag Fear or Freedom began trending before the exchange had even finished. Trump tried to laugh it off, forcing a grin. Cute speech. Really touching. Maybe they'll give you another Oscar for it. But the words rang hollow, brittle. Denzel's reply came without hesitation, sharp as a blade. The stage I care about isn't in Hollywood. It's here, where truth gets tested against lies, where power meets accountability. And you, sir, just failed the test. A roar filled the chamber, not of rage, but of applause, genuine and swelling like a tidal wave. For the first time in years, Trump looked small behind his desk, while Denzel looked like the voice of a people who had waited too long to be heard. The final gavel had not yet struck, but everyone in the chamber already knew where the balance had shifted. What began as another spectacle of Trump's bravado had transformed into something else entirely, a defining moment. Denzel Washington, calm as a stone in a storm, stood unmoved as the room erupted in applause. Trump pounded the desk again, trying to reclaim control. "This is my America," he shouted, voice straining. "I made it strong. I made it respected again." Denzel didn't shout back. He didn't need to. He let the silence linger until Trump's words seemed to echo back against him, hollow and worn. Then Denzel spoke, his tone firm and deliberate, cutting through the chaos with surgical clarity. "No. This isn't your America. This is our America. And it will outlive every wall, every cage, every lie you try to build around it. You mistake control for leadership, but history doesn't remember who shouted the loudest, it remembers who stood tallest when it mattered." The chamber froze. Even the judge leaned forward, captivated by the gravity of the words. A journalist whispered, "That's the line." And it was. Within minutes, the moment was everywhere, on live feeds, clipped into reels, blasted across timelines under a single headline. Denzel to Trump, "This is our America." Trump sat back, his face pale, his hands trembling just slightly. He tried to scoff, but the sound cracked in his throat. For the first time, the man who branded himself unshakable looked shaken. As the gavel finally struck, sealing the session, Denzel turned toward the crowd. He didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't seek approval. He simply met their eyes, one by one, and walked out, leaving behind not a performance, but a reminder. The people in that room would never forget what they had witnessed. Not a clash of egos, but a collision of truths. Not a man shouting to hold power, but another refusing to shrink before it. And long after the headlines faded, the echo of Denzel's words would remain, etched into the conscience of a country searching for its voice. History won't remember who shouted the loudest. It will remember who stood tallest when it mattered. Denzel didn't just respond, he redefined the moment. And that's why this clash will never be forgotten.